Billions to Trillions to Action. Mobilizing Finance for Development, 2016 to 2030. Domestic Resource Mobilization with Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala.
The role of domestic resource mobilization in financing the SDGs will be critically important. Some estimates have it anywhere from 50 to 80% of resources needed to finance the SDGs will have to come from domestic resources. This makes DRM, domestic resource mobilization, critically important. Most countries finance their development from their own domestic resources anyway. The big issue is, what are the constraints? If you look at many developing countries, you'll find issues with tax administration constraints, weak capacity for implementation. That's certainly the case in my own country, Nigeria. Issues with trying to get an efficient and effective tax policy that also responds to ease of people for paying their taxes. So both the tax policy and tax administration are linked in several ways. And I believe a strong push to strengthen tax administration will help to improve the resources available domestically. Now, in Nigeria, tax to GDP ratio at about 12% of our new rebased GDP of 510 billion is on the low side, and non-oil tax to GDP is lower at 4%. According to the IMF, that means there's an opportunity of at least 4 percentage points of GDP by improving tax policy and tax administration. So whilst our revenue sources are not diversified, our economy as a whole is diversified, with 51% services, 26% industry, 22% agriculture, and we saw that we could certainly do better with taxation. So what we did is first to get a diagnostic. What really is wrong with tax administration and where are we not doing well on tax policy? One, in terms of the payment of taxes, only 25% of registered SMEs are paying tax. So there's an opportunity. Audits were taking us too long, 1 to 2 audits per person per year, and that of course delays the payments of taxes. So speeding up our audit system. Filing, at one point in time, 65% of businesses had not filed. So we could speed up filing, getting more people in the tax net. We started all that work. We gave a target of an additional $500 million in 2014 out of these efforts, and we actually did 600 million. And projections are that in the medium term, we could do an additional billion a year just from improvements in tax administration. So, and then we will get to tax policy, where we have one of the lowest VAT rates in the world at 5%. And so plans to put in a new VAT law that would double that would also be helpful. So we have, I think, a great deal of opportunity. I strongly believe that in Nigeria, we could get that extra 4 percentage points of GDP. In fact, the target we had set ourselves is that we should try to reach tax to GDP ratio of 20% in the medium term. It's absolutely vital to say that subnational governments are critical to the development process. And if we are to achieve the SDGs, we will have to engage subnational governments very strongly in terms of delivery of services. I think there are variations from country to country. Some systems have a federal structure, but a lot of the finance is centralized. But in others, there's a very decentralized system, and Nigeria belongs to the latter. Nigeria is very fiscally decentralized, and that in itself may be exciting on the one hand, but it's also quite challenging on the other, in that the constitution in Nigeria gives the states so much autonomy over the way they spend money. Actually, the resources of the country are split, that 52% goes to the federal government and 48% to the states and local governments. So they spend almost 50% of the resources in the country, but there's limited accountability at that level for the spending of those resources. There's also a tendency to just wait for the resources generated in the center to be shared, instead of trying to generate locally, internally generated revenues. So that is really, I think, two areas we need to pay attention to. I think states, and in the Nigerian context, are capable of generating more revenue and incentives should be put in their way, to do that. Sometimes from the federal level, we tried matching grants. For instance, to encourage more expenditure on primary education, we had a matching grant, from the federal level. If you could match this, you would get the grant. So different sorts of incentives, but generally, I think fiscal decentralization is good, but it has to be merged with incentives to make sure that resources are properly generated, and accountability for delivery of services and efficient use of resources will be critically important.